The plot of tonight's Insight could have come straight from an American dime novel. Two Irish Americans go drinking in the Bronx. By the end of the night, one is dead, shot with the other man's gun. Now, the gun belonged to a policeman, a cop with the NYPD. The dead man was originally from Derry, and as you'll hear, he had quite a past. Even his mother has to admit he was no angel. But now she's moving heaven and earth to find out what really happened to Hesse Phelan. Trevor Burney has the insight.
New York, a city where Irish men and women come to chase their dreams. But for Patrick Hesse Phelan from Derry's Bogside, dreams of starting a new life ended in tragedy.
Three years ago today, Patrick Hesse Phelan, known as Hesse to his friends, met his death in New York. He died from a bullet to the head, a bullet fired from the gun of a New York policeman. His death was classed as suicide, but that was never accepted by Hesse Phelan's mother, Anna, who took on the might of the New York Police Department. And 2 days ago, an Irish-American police officer, Richard Malloy, was sent for trial accused of murder.
Hesse was just the average young lad running around the town. I had no bother with Hesse until the trouble started. Then, like every other mother in Northern Ireland, we suffered a lot trying to keep track of what they were doing and what they weren't doing.
Anna Phelan had caused a worry. From a teenager living in the Brandywell area of Derry who served a jail sentence for rioting, Hesse Phelan progressed into the ranks of the INLA. In 1977, he and another INLA man, Colin McNutt, tried to hijack a car at William Street in the city. The driver of the car, an undercover soldier, shot McNutt dead. Phelan was later arrested and served 5 years. On his release, he again got involved and served a second term for attempting to smuggle explosives across the border. After years of imprisonment, Hesse Phelan, encouraged by his mother and sister, left Northern Ireland for America.
So Hesse stayed with me for about 8 or 9 months. And then he moved to the Bronx, which was home away from home. And at that time, I didn't understand it, but since then I have come to realize what he meant. It's like being home in Derry. But he loved being here because he had a job. Some days he'd be working 7 days a week. Some weeks he'd be working 7 days. He would be doing the painting for his boss, and then he'd be doing private jobs for friends and other people. So he just had a terrific time here. At times he did get homesick, which I am here 28 years and I still get homesick, especially Christmas. But I would ask him if he ever felt like going home. He says no, he wouldn't. He was here to stay.
This is Bainbridge Avenue in the Bronx area of New York. Over the past 15 years, tens of thousands of Irish immigrants have settled here. It was an area where Hesse Phelan felt at home.
Many of the Irish immigrants who lived along Bainbridge Avenue have now moved to more prosperous areas. But in the 80s and early 90s, the Irish who were living illegally in New York, like Hesse Phelan, were a tight-knit community.
This was all Irish at the time, all thousands and thousands of Irish from all over Ireland. It was just like a 32 counties here. But now it's changed now, since 85 to 99, it's completely changed. A lot of Irish around here has moved out, and the neighbourhood's kind of gone down. Like, gone down as far as Irish concerned. There's a lot of Puerto Ricans and blacks have moved on. There's kind of taken over the neighbourhood, and the Irish has moved on up the greener pastures up more in Woodland and all. He was a hard worker like the rest of us, and he just wanted his work, done his work. He just went through life like us.
And you and him knocked about together here, did you?
Oh yeah, we're very good friends here. He's one of my best friends here. So, usually drink along with him all the time, especially at the weekends, like.
Another person known to frequent the bars along Bainbridge Avenue was Richard Malloy. The New York policeman had become acquainted with friends of Hesse Phelan. When Malloy walked into the same bar as Phelan on a cold Saturday night in January 1996, it was the beginning of a chain of events which would see Phelan dead and Malloy charged with murder.
If you read the newspapers, and you read the newspaper articles written about him by people who are not fond of Richard Malloy, or perhaps police officers in general, you might think Richie were a loose cannon, a wild cowboy. I know Richard Malloy as a friend and as a client. And he is a sweet young man my heart aches for him and for his entire family. Richie is not capable of killing a bug. He is the most gentle guy I ever met.
Hesse Phelan spent the last hours of his life drinking here at what used to be the Oak Bar. Late in the evening, he left with Officer Richard Malloy. The two men walked a short distance to an apartment in the building behind me. Within an hour, Hesse Phelan was dead. It remains a mystery to this day exactly what happened inside that apartment. What is known is that Hesse Phelan's death divided the Irish community here in New York.
Other drinkers who were in the Oak Bar on the same evening say Hesse Phelan was drunk. When Officer Malloy arrived late in the evening, his Donegal-born girlfriend Maggie McGrath, who was the barmaid, told him Phelan had been annoying her and asked the policeman to take him across to her apartment to sleep off the drink. What happened next in that fourth-floor apartment is hotly disputed. Hesse Phelan was only 5 foot tall, and his family say Malloy manhandled him out of the bar and across the street. Malloy's lawyers say once inside the apartment, he helped Phelan onto a couch and was putting on the television when he noticed the Derry man had his gun. Hesse Phelan's family say Malloy was shouting at him to shut up and threatening him with his gun. Phelan dared him to pull the trigger, and he did. When police answered the emergency call made by Malloy, he told them Phelan had committed suicide with his service revolver. Police accepted Malloy's account and spent only a couple of hours at the scene. No forensic examination was carried out and no fingerprints were taken from the gun.
It was a Sunday morning and it was 10 minutes of 11. I'll never forget it. And I was just putting out my cigarette to go down to collect my grandson to go to 12 o'clock mass. And when I looked at the window who was standing with Father McKenna, and I called New York, and he nodded his head. And I says, is it serious? And Father McKenna called, are you not going to let me in? And I'm still shouting as I didn't know I was shouting at this point. But I went out anyway and opened the door, and I says, is it serious, fellas? He says, are you going to let me in? So he come in and he sat me down, and I says, a motoring accident? Somehow I had that it was motoring. He says, no. He says, there's an incident in New York, and it's a shooting incident. I says, what? And he says, Heslin's dead.
But as a devastated Anna Phelan began to grieve, 3,000 miles away, friends of her son were already beginning to question Richard Malloy's version of events. Their suspicions were further fuelled when another Irishman, Cormac Lee, told them he had actually been in the apartment when Hesse Phelan died. He said he was in the kitchen and heard the two men arguing. A few minutes later, he said he heard Phelan shout, "Go on, go on." A loud gunshot then rang out, and Cormac Lee ran into the room to see Phelan lying dead and the policeman putting his gun back into his holster.
I have a sense of justice in me, and I say, like, it's wrong that somebody should get away with murder. Like, that's obvious. That's the first reaction. And then you felt a kind of, there was a terrible slight to me personally, not just me, to the immigrant community, because it was like, here was an immigrant shot that potentially has been shot by a police officer, and they've just glossed over it. There was no fingerprints taken, there was no investigation. They just says, here's one of ours is involved in a shooting with an immigrant, and it doesn't matter. Ours is more important than the immigrant, you know.
Said murder, and they split. They very divisively split. In fact, the bar, the two owners haven't spoken since. The bar has been sold, and they were arguing about what had happened.
As far as NYPD was concerned, the case was closed and it was left to a medical examiner to investigate the cause of death. Irish newspapers in New York appeared to take the official line, but the unease was growing on the streets of the Bronx, and it was filtering back to Derry.
All the stories that was coming through here on the phone was, we picked it up first that it was an accident. And we were sympathising with this cop. So then I had a call. I don't know who called me. There were that many. And I happened to say, it's a terrible accident. And whoever was on that phone says, Mrs. Phelan, it was no accident. There's something very sinister. And we haven't really got the ins and outs of it yet. But you'll be told, you'll be notified as time goes on when we get the background of what went on here. But then, when I was asked, somebody asked me at the coffin, was Heslin right-handed or left-handed? Which I thought was why is people asking that? And I let it go at that.
The medical examiner investigating the case was also keen to establish whether Hesse Phelan was indeed right or left-handed. The bullet which killed the 39-year-old had entered his head close to his left eye, a wound which would have been extremely difficult for a right-handed person, as Phelan was, to inflict. Frustrated by the lack of information coming from America, Anna Phelan decided to travel to New York in search of answers. Bronx, Graham Field had helped set up the Friends of Hesse Phelan committee to campaign for a proper investigation.
Now, when Mrs. Phelan came out, it added more momentum to the thing, because it was, like, after all, it wasn't my son, he was only my friend, and it was her son, and she came out, and there was a great determination there to get something done, you know, and she wasn't going to walk away. Like, initially when she came out, they would give us sort of whitewash, like, oh, we're doing this, we're doing that. And the woman was persistent, and she continually badgered them all the time and looked for meetings, you know, lobbied congressmen, done all that sort of stuff. And she gave the thing a bit of a figurehead, you know.
With the New York police refusing to reinvestigate the case, Anna Phelan went to the district attorney in the Bronx and pleaded with him to properly examine her son's death.
Before I left, I says, I'm going to do my best to get this suicide wiped off this, because I know he didn't commit suicide. So I arrived in New York, and all I could hear about the blue line. So I was asking what he's mean by the blue line. He says, in other words, it's a wall of silence. You're going up against a wall of silence. We got to meet D.A. Johnson. And we come out of the office, and Graham Friel says to me, he says, well, what way do you feel now, Anna? I says, well, Graham, the way I feel is we got into a better furnished office, and the men have better suits on them. I says, I'm no further forward after coming out of that. I says, they just placated me, answering me. I says, there's no difference.
Anna Phelan returned to Derry with no answers, only hardened suspicions of what had happened to her son. For weeks the trail goes cold, until the medical examiner reveals the results of her investigation.
I phoned the medical examiner and explained to her who it was. And she came back on the phone and said, Mrs. Phelan, my findings are homicide, not suicide. And I says, excuse me, I says, would you repeat that? And she says, homicide, not suicide.
Good evening, everyone. Sue's off. I'm Jane Hansen. Was it murder or was it suicide?
Well, tonight a New York City police officer is under indictment on murder charges. Officer Richard Malloy is accused of killing a man after a night of drinking. The officer claimed that man took his own life, but the medical examiner and prosecutors say that simply isn't so.
The tenacity shown by Anna Phelan and the campaigners in the Bronx had paid off.
I felt, you know, there was a sense of, well, at least now they're going to do something about it. You know, and you didn't get no satisfaction from it or anything. I never, like, you didn't feel like saying, oh yes, you know, that's great. It's just, it was like, it's about time.
Eamon Lynch has been covering the Hesse Phelan story. He says murder charges against New York policemen are a rare phenomenon.
The NYPD are like any other police force. They're loath to admit to the rotten apples in the barrel. And with 35,000 police officers, they've probably got more than most other cities do. They don't like to charge their own, and they certainly don't like to see their own convicted of murder, if that turns out to be the case.
Richard Malloy declined to be interviewed for this programme. The police officer's lawyer, George Valario, spoke on his behalf.
Here you have a young man, Richard Malloy, who liked Hesse Phelan very much. He said, Georgie, he was like a little kid. I had nothing against this guy. There was no reason in the world why I would ever want to harm him. I put him in taxi cabs when he was over the top, when he was intoxicated. I've escorted him home. As a matter of fact, Hesse Patrick Phelan, he had such a relationship with Maggie and Richie, he had given them the keys to his apartment. And as he said, in case anything ever happens to me. That's the relationship that they had. So I really don't understand why anybody would think that Richie were capable of doing this. I mean, it's just, when you know him, you know he didn't do this.
I am not going to say alleged murderer. I am calling him a murderer. For he entered the apartment that night. He arm-locked my son in the Oak Bar and dragged him across the street, kicking, into Maggie McGrath's apartment at 12:05. At 1 o'clock, my son's dead, and the cop walks out of the apartment.
Sometime from the time that Richard left the Oak Bar and proceeded to Maggie McGrath's apartment, which was directly across the street, Hesse Patrick Phelan got a hold of Richie's service revolver. When they were in the apartment, Richie tried to comfort him. He gave him a pillow, he gave him a blanket, he opened up a window, and his final act of grace was to go and put on the television set. In attempting to do so, he turned around and he saw Hesse Patrick Phelan with his service revolver in his hand. At that moment, the gun went off and Hesse Patrick Phelan was dead.
And I visualise in my head every night in the week what happened. I don't know what they were arguing about. People will say it was about Barney Logue. Others will tell you it was about Maggie McGrath. I don't know what the argument was about. But I feel that to me, Hessen was looking to get out for another drink. And every time he tried to get off the couch, Malloy put the gun at him. And then Hessen has probably says, Malloy says, if you don't shut up, I'll, you know. And Hessen has said, you haven't the guts, go on, go on. That's what I see what happened that night.
Richard Malloy is denying all charges against him. What he can't deny is his police record and the complaints against him over his 10 years service.
On duty, he had fired his gun on several occasions, at one point actually shooting and killing a young man in the Bronx. He fired his gun several times. He has been accused of brutality, wrongful arrest, assault, making threats, and off duty, there have been at least 7 accounted incidents where he fired his gun or drew his gun in a bar in the Bronx, including twice shooting out the lights in a bar because they were too bright, shooting at a rat in a bar that he saw, stepping outside and pulling unlicensed guns and just firing it into the air. So at the very least you could say he's got a habit of mixing his drink with gunplay. It's not all that uncommon in this city for an officer to retire after 20 years without firing his gun at all during that time. Malloy had half a dozen incidents where he fired his gun in just 10 years on the force before we even get to the Hesse Phelan case. So it's an extremely high rate of attrition.
Ex-New York detective Roland Cadeau was hired by Richard Malloy's lawyer to investigate the case.
Extremely active officers are always being accused of misconduct, always. You'll never find one that's not active in the street that doesn't get accused of misconduct. That doesn't mean that none of them ever do create some situation where there's misconduct. In this case, I think many of the things that are being said are being trumped up. There's a lot of trumped up stuff here. It's coming from biased people, not from people who have no axe to grind here.
Since Rich Malloy first appeared in court in October 1996, it's been a roller coaster ride both for him and the Phelans. Malloy was placed on unarmed police duties. Recently, he married his girlfriend Maggie McGrath, and they've had a baby. During one of the pre-trial hearings, it was revealed that shortly after being charged with murder, Officer Malloy had left New York to sign up for the US Army Reserve and had requested to be shipped out to Germany. His bail was raised to $150,000. Last August, the Phelans filed a civil suit against the New York police for £14 million. A month later, Anna Phelan came face to face with the man charged with her son's murder.
Do you know, I had no feelings whatsoever. You know, I was shocked really at myself that I was able to look at him, because I was afraid I would have lost it and made for him, you know, lose my dignity. But somebody was praying for me, and I was praying to myself that I wouldn't lose my dignity when I looked at this guy. But in saying that, he kept the head down.
Observers of the Phelan case say it has caused a split in the Irish community.
A lot of Irish immigrants, especially from the north, told newspapers that they were aware of police cover-ups. They had grown up with police cover-ups, so they weren't at all surprised that Hesse's death might have been covered up and first of all reported as a suicide, and then that was changed to murder. Whereas Irish Americans, a lot of them have grown up with police members in the family, so they'd be more trusting maybe of police, and they were inclined to believe Malloy's story.
The community did break down over generational divide. Malloy's father was a cop, and a lot of the Irish immigrants who arrived in this city 40 years ago were cops and firemen. And whereas if you look at the people who have pushed this case on the Phelan family's behalf, what you have are immigrants from Northern and Southern Ireland who came here in the 1980s, and many of whom believe that they received similar treatment from the RUC or from the Gardaí or whatever else, and believe that they're just not going to put up with it here, however much basis in fact that may have. But it's certainly a generational divide, the old Irish versus the new Irish.
On Tuesday of this week, Richard Malloy made his latest court appearance. He was told his trial will begin on February 22nd. Anna Phelan is already making plans to be there.
No one would want to believe that a son would either accidentally or intentionally take their own life. As a Catholic, I know that suicide would be tantamount to eternal damnation. No mother or parent, as I am, would want to accept such a thought. Who would also want to believe that a son would be so foolhardy as to take a gun and play with it, which in this case it may have accidentally discharged. We just don't know. I don't know what was going through that poor soul's mind. I've said many a prayer for the repose of his soul, and I pray every day for Richie Malloy's family. His mother is so traumatized by this. His poor father, who led an exemplary life on the police department, is so traumatized by this. Every penny they had in the world, they've paid for investigators and lawyers, and they put their home up to secure his release. It's just a terrible, terrible tragedy for all the people involved. And God willing, it'll be over soon, satisfactory to everyone.
The entire Phelan family and their supporters in New York are the only reason this case is actually still alive. Otherwise, it would have been closed several years ago as a suicide, the day after it happened. It's only the fact that they have brought constant pressure, both on the district attorney and on the coroner's office to bring out the evidence that they have that it's actually gone this far. Otherwise, Hesse Phelan would have been written off as a suicide and no one would care any further.
It's been 3 years since the death of Hesse Phelan, a death the New York Police Department originally put down as suicide. But now, after an arduous campaign, Anna Phelan will finally see Officer Richard Malloy stand accused of murdering her son. The wheels of justice have moved slowly for Anna Phelan, and even now she's under no illusion this trial will bring her any satisfaction, whatever the verdict.
All I have now is a headstone. And Malloy's mother has still her son to talk to. I don't. I have to go to a grave, stand, talk to a headstone. And I'll be asking Heslin to stand beside me too and help me through it. I feel that if I saw this boy convicted, I feel then I would be able to let go and try and move on a bit with my life, whatever time I've left.